Hydraulic fluid tastes like copper and ammonia when it floods through tubes you do not remember having. That was the first coherent thought that assembled itself from the screaming chaos inside what used to be my skull. Not my skull anymore. Metal plates, riveted iron, something like bone but wrong, desperately wrong, and the fluid pumping through channels where blood should be carried, that acrid chemical signature straight to whatever passed for my tongue. Except I had no tongue. I had a Vox grill. I had speaker cones salvaged from Imperial equipment, wired backward into meat that should not still function, and when I tried to scream, what emerged was a bass rumble that shook the ground beneath me. Beneath my feet, my massive, clawed, piston-driven feet. The workshop sprawled around me in a nightmare of improvised engineering. Scrap metal rose in mountains against walls painted with crude glyphs in what I desperately hoped was red paint but knew, with nauseating certainty, was not. Chains hung from a ceiling lost in oily darkness. Sparks showered from somewhere to my left where a blowtorch hissed against resistant steel. The smell hit me next, overwhelming even through filters that should have blocked it. A fungal reek underlaid with promethium and rust, and something organic rotting in the tropical heat. My optical feeds, if that was what to call these things, bolted where my eyes used to be, resolved the scene in stuttering frames. Green skin, yellow teeth. Faces that belonged to creatures from my worst fever dreams, now rendered in horrifying clarity. Orks. I was surrounded by orks. One of them noticed my movement, its face split into a grin that seemed to contain more teeth than should fit in any jaw, and it bellowed something in that guttural language that scratched against my auditory processors like broken glass. Other greenskins turned. Tools clattered to the ground. One of them, smaller than the rest, but wearing goggles strapped over its eyes with wire that had clearly been ripped from Imperial equipment, capered forward with what I can only describe as joy. "It's workin'!" the creature shrieked. "Da hummy brain, it's workin'!" The word brain triggered something. A memory surfaced through the chemical haze, sharp-edged and terrible. My name was Corporal Theodore Marsh. I had been a tank driver in the 77th Armored Regiment. We had been defending a refinery complex on the frontier when the green tide came. The last thing I remembered was fire, the hatch of my Le Mans Russ being torn open like paper, massive hands reaching in to drag me into the smoke. I tried to move. My body responded, but wrong. Everything was wrong. I felt pistons fire where muscles should flex. I felt the grind of gears in my shoulders, the rotation of joints that moved in ways human joints never could. When I raised what should have been my arm, I saw instead a massive mechanical limb ending in a power claw large enough to crush a man in half. The claw opened and closed at my mental command, servos whining, and the motion sent feedback screaming up neural pathways that had been rewired to interpret machine data as physical sensation. I was inside the machine. No. I was the machine. The smaller orc, the one with goggles, circled me with that horrible eager glee. It carried a wrench in one hand and what looked like a severed human head in the other, though the head had been hollowed out and filled with circuitry. A jar hung from its belt, and through the murky fluid inside, I could see another brain, just floating there, waiting. Told him it would work, the creature was saying to no one in particular. Told him human brains got the best thinking bits. Makes the dread smarter, see? Not like the last ones. The last ones just twitched and screamed till day broke. I tried to speak. What emerged was a burst of static followed by words in a voice that was mine but amplified, distorted, pushed through speakers never designed for human language. "What did you do to me?" The orc laughed. It actually laughed, slapping its knee with the wrench and nearly braining itself in the process. "Put you into dread, didn't I? You's gonna be the best dread on the whole planet. All dat humy tactical thinking, see, wrapped up in proper orky hardware. The boss is gonna love ya. Dread. Dreadnought." They had taken my brain, my actual living brain, and wired it into one of their crude walking death machines. I tried to feel my body, my real body, the one made of flesh and blood and bone. There was nothing, just the feedback of hydraulics and the constant low thrum of a reactor somewhere in my chest cavity. When I looked down, I saw a torso of rusted armor plates bolted together with total disregard for aesthetics or engineering standards. Ammunition belts fed into ports on my left side. A cannon of some kind jutted from my right arm, a brutal thing that looked like it had been assembled from the wrecks of 3 different vehicles. The screaming started then, not from me, though I tried, from somewhere deeper in the workshop, where shadows hung thick and chains rattled against concrete. Another voice, human, begging in that particular way that meant all hope had been abandoned. I recognized the tone. I had heard it on the battlefield. I had heard it in my own throat. "Shut that one up," one of the larger orcs grunted. "It's annoying." The sound stopped with a wet crunch. I found that I could move. Not gracefully, the machine I inhabited had been built for raw power rather than finesse, but I could take steps that shook the ground and swing arms that could demolish walls. The greenskins watched me with that mixture of glee and evaluation that I would come to recognize as their standard expression toward anything that might be useful. One of them prodded my leg with a hammer, testing the armor, and I felt the impact as a dull pressure translated through sensors I did not understand. "Needs more Daka," the large one announced. "Already got loads of Daka," the goggled mech boy protested. "Got the big shooter in the chest, got the cannon on the arm, got the claw for when you wants to get personal." "What more Daka you want?" "More," they argued. I stood there in my prison of iron and wire, trying to process what had happened to me, trying to find some edge of sanity to cling to as the reality of my situation crystallized into something I could not deny. My brain was the only organic part of me left. Everything else had been discarded, presumably fed to the orcs or simply thrown away. I was a consciousness trapped in a machine built by creatures who viewed engineering as a form of religious ecstasy and safety standards as a human weakness. The mech boy returned its attention to me. "Right, y'all need a proper shaking down. Gotta make sure all the gubbins is working before the way kicks off. Way." Even through my terror, I recognized the word. Every soldier in the Imperial Guard learned what that word meant. It was the Orkish term for their crusades of violence, their great gatherings of war, the tidal waves of green flesh and crude machinery that swept across star systems like a plague of locusts made from murder. If a war was coming, it meant thousands of orcs, perhaps millions, mobilizing for war, and I would be marching with them. "I will not," I said. The words came out clearer now, my brain apparently adapting to the Vox systems. "I am a soldier of the Imperium. I will not serve greenskin filth." The mech boy stared at me. Then it started laughing again, harder than before, until tears streamed from beneath its goggles. "Hear dat, boys? The Dread thinks it's got a choice." Other orcs joined the laughter. The sound filled the workshop, bouncing off metal walls, echoing in my audio receptors until I wanted to tear them out. But I could not tear anything out. I could not even reach my own head. The arms of this body were not designed for self-maintenance. They were designed for killing. "Let me explain something," the mech boy said, wiping its eyes. "Your brain, right, the meaty bit, it's wired into the reactor. You know what that means? Means if you don't do what the Dread is built for, if you don't stomp and shoot and crump like a proper Dread, then the reactor don't get fed. And if the reactor don't get fed, it takes what it needs from the nearest organic bit." It tapped a finger against my chest plate. "That's you, Hughie. Your brain is lunch." I did not believe it at first. I thought it was a lie, a manipulation, the kind of psychological torture that enemies sometimes employed. But as I stood there in the following hours, as the orcs went about their business of strapping additional weapons to my frame and arguing about whether I needed more armor or more guns, I felt something, a hunger, a pull. It started as a vague discomfort, like the early stages of hypoglycemia, and it grew steadily worse. The reactor in my chest needed fuel. It needed violence. I understood then, with a horror that transcended anything I had experienced in a lifetime of warfare, exactly what had been done to me. The mech boy had not just trapped me in a machine. It had created a feedback loop of dependency that would force me to participate in slaughter simply to survive. Every kill would feed the reactor. Every moment of peace would starve it. I was not a prisoner. I was an addict before I had ever taken my first fix. The war kicked off 3 days later. I know it was 3 days because my internal chronometer counted every second with mechanical precision, and I spent every one of those seconds fighting the growing hunger in my chassis. The orcs did not seem to notice my distress. They were too busy preparing for war, loading ammunition, bolting on final modifications, painting crude glyphs of violence onto every available surface. They painted me too, red, because red apparently made things go faster in orc belief, with yellow checks on my shoulder plates, because, according to the mech boy, yellow was lucky. When the horde finally moved, I moved with them. I had no choice. The reactor's demands had grown impossible to ignore, and the mech boy had rigged my legs to follow the mob regardless of my mental commands. I marched in a sea of green flesh, surrounded by ramshackle vehicles and other dreadnoughts that stomped along with the mindless enthusiasm of machines that had never known humanity. Some of them were piloted by orcs. Others, I realized with growing horror, contained brains like mine, human prisoners converted into unwilling war machines. I could hear them sometimes, fragments of Imperial Gothic crackling through the interference, begging for death or simply weeping in endless loops. The target was a mining outpost. I saw it from a distance as we crested a ridge, a cluster of prefabricated structures surrounded by ore processors and atmospheric scrubbers, the standard Imperial design for resource extraction on hostile worlds. I had seen 100 similar installations during my service. I had defended them, protected them. Now I was coming to destroy one. Wah! The cry went up from 1,000 throats, a psychic pressure that I felt even through my mechanical insulation. The horde surged forward, a tide of violence that swept down the ridge like an avalanche of green flesh and crude metal. I moved with them. My legs fired their pistons in a ground-eating stride that carried me toward the outpost faster than I could have run in my human body. The reactor purred with anticipation. Defenders scrambled into position. I saw them through enhanced optics, men and women in the tan uniforms of mining security, frantically setting up crew-served weapons and activating perimeter turrets. They were not soldiers, they were civilians with basic combat training, and they were about to face the worst the galaxy had to offer. Part of me wanted to shout a warning. Part of me wanted to tell them to run, to abandon the installation and flee into the wilderness, to do anything but stand in the path of what was coming. Instead, I raised my cannon arm and fired. The first shot was instinct. The reactor screamed for fuel and my arm responded before my conscious mind could intervene, sending a shell the size of a man's torso hurtling toward the defensive line. It struck an autocannon emplacement and detonated with enough force to scatter debris across 50 meters. Bodies flew. The reactor drank deep, and the hunger in my chest subsided for one blessed moment. Then it returned, stronger than before. I killed 11 people in the first minute of that assault. Each death fed the machine that had replaced my body. Each death pushed back the starvation that threatened to consume my brain. I watched through optical feeds as my power claw tore through a security officer who had been trying to reload a shotgun. I felt the feedback of his ribs shattering beneath the pressure. I heard his screams through audio pickups tuned to capture the sounds of suffering. And I could not stop. The orcs cheered. They loved me, in their brutal way. The mech boy capered alongside my stomping feet, pointing at each kill with proprietary pride. See what I made? Best dread on the whole planet. I retreated inside myself as the slaughter continued. There was nowhere else to go. My body was a weapon in service to monsters, and my mind was a hostage to the reactor that kept it alive. I built walls in the space where my consciousness still existed, trying to separate myself from the carnage I was inflicting. It did not work. The neural interfaces ensured that I felt everything, every kill, every scream, every moment of violence that fed the engine in my chest. The outpost fell in less than an hour. The orcs swarmed through the ruins, looting anything that was not bolted down and quite a few things that were. They dragged survivors from collapsed buildings and did things to them that I refuse to describe even now. I stood in the center of the destruction. My ammunition depleted, my power claw dripping with organic residue, and I felt the reactor settle into a satisfied idle. For now it was fed. The mech boy appeared at my feet, grinning up at me with that horrible joy, You did good, Hughie, real good. Boss is impressed. Says you get to lead deer next assault. I wanted to die. The desire was overwhelming, a longing for oblivion that transcended anything I had experienced in my human life. But the reactor would not let me die. It needed my brain to function, to direct the systems it powered, to serve as the tactical intelligence that made me more effective than a simple orc pilot. I was valuable, I was useful, and in the economy of orc warfare, useful things were kept alive. More days passed, more assaults, more atrocities that I was forced to commit with my own mechanical hands. The hunger cycle continued, an endless oscillation between starvation and satiation that left no room for anything else. I stopped counting kills after the first 100. I stopped recognizing faces after the first dozen. I became what the orcs had designed me to be, a weapon pure and simple, stripped of conscience and compassion and anything that might have once made me human. But something else was happening, something I did not notice at first because the horror of my immediate existence consumed all available attention. The way I thought was changing. Slowly, imperceptibly, the neural interfaces that connected me to the orcish machinery were doing more than just translating commands. They were bleeding their nature into my consciousness. I first noticed it during the assault on a pilgrim convoy. We had ambushed them on a road between two shrines, and as I waded through the wreckage of their transport vehicles, killing those who fought and ignoring those who fled, I caught myself thinking that this was fun, not satisfying in the way that feeding the reactor was satisfying, but genuinely enjoyable. The chaos, the violence, the simple clarity of combat without the burden of morality or strategy. For one terrible moment, I understood why the orcs lived the way they did. The thought horrified me. I retreated into my mental walls and tried to purge the contamination from my consciousness, but it came back. Each time I fired my weapons, each time I crushed an enemy beneath my feet, the pleasure receptors that the mech boy had wired into my neural pathways lit up with savage joy. I was being conditioned, trained, slowly converted from a human prisoner into something that thought like the creatures who had imprisoned me. "You're getting better," the mech boy observed after another successful assault. "Moving smoother, shooting straighter, almost like a proper orc." "I am not an orc," I said, but the words felt hollow. The campaign continued. We moved from target to target, following a pattern of violence that seemed random but apparently served some deeper orcish logic. Other warbands joined our own. The war grew, swelling with each victory, drawing greenskins from across the sector like moths to a flame of destruction. I marched at the front of the column now, a position of honor in orc hierarchy, and the other dreadnoughts deferred to me in ways I did not understand. One of them contained a human mind. I discovered this during a lull in the fighting, when we were waiting for the mech boys to repair damage from the previous assault. The other dreadnought stood beside me in the repair bay, a hulking mass of welded armor and oversized weapons, and through the static of inter-machine communication, I heard a voice. "Help me." The words were barely intelligible, distorted by damage and decay. I turned my optical sensors toward the source and found myself looking at a machine even more heavily modified than my own. Additional armor had been bolted over the original chassis. Weapons jutted from every available surface, and somewhere inside, behind layers of iron and madness, another human consciousness was screaming. "Who are you?" I asked. I was Lieutenant Commander Patricia Holloway, Imperial Navy, captured at the siege of... I don't remember the name. I don't remember anything anymore. Just the hunger, just the killing. Please, kill me. End this. "I cannot reach you," I said. "My arms are not designed for that kind of precision work." "Then find a way. Find someone who can. I am losing myself. The machine is eating what is left of my mind. Soon there will be nothing left. Just another dread, just another monster in the horde." I wanted to promise her something, rescue perhaps, or mercy, or at least the acknowledgement that her suffering mattered. But what could I offer? I was as trapped as she was, maybe more so, because I had not yet lost enough of myself to stop caring about the loss. "Hold on," I said. "As long as you can." "I have been holding on for 2 years," she replied. "I am so tired." The repair crews interrupted our conversation. Mech boys swarmed over both of us, tightening bolts and replacing damaged components and arguing about optimal weapon loadouts. When they finished, Patricia's dreadnought was hauled away to another part of the camp, and I did not see her again for 6 days. When I did, she was not Patricia anymore. The dreadnought moved differently. The hesitation was gone, the moments of confusion that had marked her as a human intelligence trapped in an alien machine. She strode through the camp with pure orcish aggression, bellowing challenges at other dreads and firing her weapons into the air in displays of dominance. The voice that emerged from her vox speakers was different too, deeper, harsher, stripped of the imperial Gothic pronunciation that had marked her origins. She had given in, or perhaps she had simply run out of resistance. Either way, Patricia Holloway was dead. The thing wearing her brain was something else entirely. I watched her rampage through a defensive position the next day, killing guardsmen with an enthusiasm that made even the orcs seem restrained. She caught a fleeing officer in one massive claw and held him up to her optical sensors, examining him with the curiosity of a child examining an insect before crushing it. The sound she made was not quite laughter, but close enough to chill whatever remained of my soul. That night I made a decision. I could not escape this body. I could not stop the reactor's demands or resist the conditioning that was slowly reshaping my consciousness. But I could perhaps slow the process. I could fight back in the only arena still available to me, the space inside my own mind. I began to count. Obsessively, compulsively, I enumerated everything I could remember about my human life. The names of my squad mates, the taste of my mother's cooking, the smell of promethium in the engine bay of my tank, the weight of a lasgun in my hands, the words of the primer that we had all been forced to memorize. Every detail, no matter how trivial, became a weapon in the battle to preserve my humanity. I recited regulations while I killed. I remembered training exercises while I crushed defensive emplacements. I replayed conversations with friends who were probably dead while I waded through the ruins of imperial settlements. The orcs thought I had gone silent, withdrawn, perhaps damaged by a hit I had taken in recent combat. They could not see the war being fought inside my neural pathways, the desperate struggle between what I had been and what the machine wanted me to become. Days turned to weeks. Weeks turned to months. The war rolled across the sector like a natural disaster, consuming everything in its path. I participated in sieges, in massacres, in atrocities that would have earned summary execution in any imperial court. The kill count in my internal records grew into numbers I refused to look at. The reactor stayed fed, and the hunger became a background constant, always present, always demanding, but manageable as long as violence continued. The changes accelerated. I noticed that my tactical processing had shifted, incorporating orcish concepts that I should not have understood. I anticipated attacks through a logic that made no sense by human standards but proved devastatingly effective on the battlefield. When I moved like an orc, aggressive, direct, trusting in momentum and firepower rather than caution and strategy. The other dreads in the horde accepted me as one of their own, and I no longer knew if that was a survival adaptation or a genuine transformation. I still counted, I still remembered, but the memories were growing distant, fading like photographs left in sunlight, losing their color and detail until only the shapes remained. I could remember that I had once had a mother, but not her face. I could remember serving in a regiment, but not the names of my fellow soldiers. I could remember being human, but not what that had actually felt like. The mech boy noticed. Of course it noticed. It spent more time examining my systems than any other machine in the horde, and it had a genius for understanding how minds worked, even if it could not have explained that understanding in words. "Your brain is changing," it told me one day, probing my neural interface with instruments that sent feedback screaming through my consciousness. "Getting more orky. That's good. Means you won't break like the others. Means you're gonna last." "I do not want to last," I said. "I want to die." "Everyone says dat at first." The mech boy shrugged, an oddly human gesture. "Den they stop wanting anything at all, just to fight, just to war. It's easier dat way, see? No more hummy thinking, no more hummy feeling, just war, forever." I tried to muster the horror that statement should have inspired. It came but weakly, like an echo of an emotion rather than the emotion itself. That absence frightened me more than anything the mech boy had actually said. The breakthrough came during an assault on an Imperial fortress. A real fortress, not the mining outposts and pilgrim convoys we had been hitting, but a star-shaped citadel bristling with defense weapons and manned by actual soldiers. The orcs threw themselves against its walls with their usual abandon, dying in waves that would have demoralized any human force. We dreads followed in their wake, providing the heavy firepower needed to crack the fortifications. I was pushing through a collapsed section of wall when I saw them. A squad of guardsmen dug into the rubble, pouring last fire into the orcish horde with the desperate determination of men who knew they were going to die, but intended to take as many enemies with them as possible. Their sergeant was shouting encouragement, and I recognized the words. "Emperor protects, hold the line, make them pay for every meter." I had shouted those same words, once, in another life. The reactor screamed for fuel. The conditioning demanded that I charge forward, crushing these defenders beneath my mechanical feet, feeding the hunger that never truly ended. But for one moment, one precious moment, I was Theodore Marsh again, Corporal Theodore Marsh of the 77th Armored Regiment, a soldier of the Imperium, a human being. I raised my cannon arm. The sergeant's eyes widened behind his gas mask as he realized what was about to happen. The men around him intensified their fire, less beams splashing uselessly against my armor, and I turned. I turned away from them and fired into the massive orcs behind me. The greenskins died in clusters. They were not expecting fire from that direction, and my position gave me clear shots into their densely packed ranks. Bodies flew. Bellows of confusion rose above the din of battle. The mech boy, somewhere in the chaos, started screaming something about malfunction, about neural contamination, about putting me down before I did more damage. I kept firing. For the first time since my capture, I was acting on my own volition. The kills still fed the reactor, still pushed back the hunger, but they were my kills now. My choices, my victims, and every orc that fell was one less monster threatening those guardsmen in the rubble. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then the other dreads reached me. Patricia, or the thing that had been Patricia, hit me first. Her power claw caught my left arm and tore it off at the shoulder joint. The feedback was agonizing, a phantom pain that existed only in neural pathways that should not have been able to feel anything. I stumbled, turned, tried to bring my remaining arm to bear. 2 more dreads crashed into me from behind. We went down in a tangle of mechanical limbs and sparking circuitry. I fought. Throne helped me. I fought as hard as I could, but I was one against dozens, and the damage accumulating in my systems was slowing my reactions with each passing second. They pinned me to the ground, their combined weight pressing me into the broken stone, and the mech boy appeared above me with fury burning in its goggle-covered eyes. "Stupid Humie," it snarled. "Shoulda known you'd break. They always break eventually. The brain rejects the machine or the machine rejects the brain, and then you gotta start over." It gestured to unseen assistants. "Crack him open, salvage what you can. We'll find a new brain." Tools descended toward my chassis. I felt the first cuts as they began to slice through armor plates, working toward the neural housing where what remained of my original brain was suspended in preservative fluid. The pain was abstract, distant, filtered through systems that were already failing. But it was still pain. Then the Valkyries came. I heard them before I saw them, the distinctive whine of their engines cutting through the roar of battle. Imperial reinforcements. Someone had gotten a distress call out before the comms were jammed, and now 3 troop carriers were descending on the fortress, their door guns blazing into the orcish horde. The greenskins turned to face this new threat momentarily, distracted from their work on my chassis. The guardsmen in the rubble surged forward. I watched through damaged optics as they overran the orc position around me, bayonets flashing in the smoke-choked air. The mech boy went down screaming under a half-dozen blades. The other dreads turned to engage, but found themselves caught between the assault from the rubble and the fresh troops pouring from the Valkyries. Someone was standing over me, a human figure, features obscured by smoke, and the flickering of my failing visual systems. They were shouting something I could not hear, gesturing to others nearby. "Get the tech adept. This one's Imperial origin." Hands began to work on my chassis, gentler than the Ork tools had been, more precise. I felt components being disconnected, rerouted, stabilized. The pain started to fade as emergency shutdown protocols finally triggered. The last thing I heard before consciousness abandoned me was a voice, filtered through my failing audio pickups, speaking words in High Gothic that I had not heard since the day of my capture. "The spirit within is wounded but not lost. We can save this one." I woke in a facility I did not recognize. The architecture was Imperial, that much was clear, all Gothic arches and devotional iconography, but the specific location was beyond my ability to determine. I was still mechanical, still a dreadnought, but the chassis had been modified, cleansed of Orkish corruption, rebuilt to Imperial specifications. A tech adept stood before me, her face more metal than flesh, optical implants whirring as they examined my systems. "Your neural patterns have stabilized," she said. "The contamination was significant but not irreversible. You are still Corporal Theodore Marsh." I tried to speak. The Vox systems engaged smoothly, producing words without the distortion that had marked my Orkish construction. "How long?" 2 years since your capture, 14 months since your recovery. We have spent that time reconstructing your chassis and purging the Xenos influence from your neural architecture. 14 months of unconsciousness, 14 months of being taken apart and put back together. I did not know whether to be grateful or horrified. What happens now? The tech adept's expression, such as it was beneath her augmetics, remained carefully neutral. "That depends on you. Your brain remains the only organic component of your being. We cannot restore your humanity in the physical sense. But we can offer you a choice," she explained. "The Imperium had use for assets like me, human intelligences bound to war machines, capable of tactical reasoning that simple servitor brains could not match. I could serve, I could fight, I could spend whatever remained of my existence as a weapon in the Emperor's name, this time willingly rather than through Xenos compulsion, or I could request termination." The tech adept said the word without judgment, as if it were merely another option on a menu. My neural pathways could be disconnected from the chassis and allowed to expire naturally. It would be painless, it would be quick, it would be an end. I thought about Patricia Holloway, about the other human brains I had glimpsed in Ork dreadnoughts, screaming or weeping or simply gone silent as the machine consumed their identities. I thought about what I had been forced to do, the kills that had fed the reactor, the atrocities I had committed with these mechanical hands. And I thought about that moment in the fortress, that one moment of clarity when I had chosen to turn my guns on the enemy, when I had been Theodore Marsh again, if only for 30 seconds. "I will serve," I said. The tech adept nodded, as if she had expected nothing else. "The Inquisition has use for specialized assets in the Ordo Xenos. You will be assigned to a team hunting greenskin infestations. Your experience makes you uniquely suited for this work." Unique. One word for it. They deployed me 6 weeks later. A different world, a different Ork incursion, but the same war I had been fighting before my capture. I marched into battle at the head of a mechanized column, my Imperial chassis gleaming with fresh paint and sacred oils. The greenskins saw me coming and bellowed their challenges. One of them, a mech boy with goggles strapped over its eyes, pointed at me with a wrench and shouted something about stealing its work. I recognized it. Not the specific individual, there was no way it could have been the same Ork across that distance, but the type, the hunger for innovation, the pride in creation, the complete absence of anything resembling conscience. I raised my cannon arm and spoke a single word into my Vox system. Not Gothic, not the language of the Imperium I had sworn to serve. The word was Wa. Then I fired, and the killing began again.